Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you don't know me, my name is Sarah, and in today's video I will be teaching you some tips and tricks to make your crochet plushies look more professional, to make them more concise and clean looking, and all around just make plushie yarn or chenille yarn easier to work with. And the first thing we're going to start with is our material list. So the first thing you need, obviously, to crochet is a crochet hook. There's a lot of different sizes out there, different brands. These are from Hobby Lobby. They're about $3 a hook, I believe, so not too expensive, and they are really nice. I like the way the hook feels, the way you can hold it, and it's smooth when you work with it. Now, I have 3 different sizes. I actually use these sizes for this size 6 chenille yarn, and it depends on the project for when I use these. So we have a 6mm, which is our biggest, 5.5, and then a 5mm. For most projects, I'll use the 5.5. It's a good balance between the two of them. You get really nice clean stitches. But if you're looking for something very stiff, maybe a figurine or something like that, you would use a 5mm. If you're looking for more kiddie-friendly doll, 6mm might be good for you. Now, my tension is fairly loose, so if your tension is tighter than mine, you might have to play around with these to figure out what your hook sizes can be for this yarn. For the most part, you can just play around with them and figure it out yourself. A good starting place would be the 5.5. For today's project, I will be working with my 5.5mm hook. I will be making a Dahlia, my baby dragon. She's a free tutorial on my YouTube channel, so if you want to crochet her with me, you can head over there and crochet along to that. The next thing you're going to need are some sewing needles. So there's a lot out there, and I know there's a lot of people who like their metal needles. I love my metal needles. When you're working with plushie yarn, I actually recommend you stay away from the metal needles and use plastic ones, preferably ones with big heads and that are smooth on the neck. Like, for example, this needle here has a little bit of a bump. This can be a little tedious to work with, trying to get it to work. These are both the same needles from Hobby Lobby. This one's just an older needle, so I believe they replaced all their needles with this. I recommend getting some of these. They're nice and smooth all the way down. They've got a big eye. And the first trick we're going to actually get into, how to make the magic ring. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have struggled with the magic ring with this yarn, especially where it snaps, or if you use the chain 2 method, it also snaps. It's happened to me so many times, it's so frustrating. So what you're gonna need for this is some size 4 yarn. Now, it can be acrylic, cotton, it can be a size 4 chenille yarn or a velvet yarn, it doesn't really matter texturally as long as it's a size 4 yarn and you know it closes well in the magic ring or the chain 2 method. So give me 1 second to get the acrylic because I completely forgot to grab it, and then we'll get into the trick. Here's the acrylic yarn I will be using for this project today. It is slightly yellow and matches fairly well with this. Now, for the most part, your acrylic yarn isn't going to be seen, so it's not a big deal if you use like a white or like a black on darker colors, and we will be using the acrylic more than once in this video. What you're gonna need is the tail end of your acrylic yarn, and you actually only need a little snip for this part. So I would do 6 to 8 inches longer when you first start. The longer, the easier it will be to work with for this trick, and then as you get better at working with this yarn, you can make it smaller and smaller until you are using as little yarn as you want. The way we're gonna take our acrylic yarn, we're going to put it around our 2 fingers. We're just going to wrap around the back and then create an X, and then finally hold it between your 2 fingers. Instead of making the magic ring, if you make it this way, we're just going to take both loops off our fingers and put it on our hook. And now we're going to get our other yarn. Normally I wouldn't put this down, but I totally forgot to get the center pull out of this. To do the center pull, I just reach into whichever side is more clearly open, and I'll reach in with a couple fingers and grab a tail. Now, sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll get the tail you're looking for. Other times you'll pull out a whole bunch of stuff before you get to it. That is a hot mess in there. Since our project is a little bit on the bigger side, it's okay to have a little bit of yarn barf. I'm gonna trim this. Usually this doesn't look like this for me. I just happened to get lucky. I'll just be trimming this off and using it for stuffing or something later. Once you have your yarn pull out, if you're doing that, I recommend doing it because it keeps the ball from falling apart, but if you want, you can peel the label off and use the outside too. You're going to hold your hook with your pointer finger and take your chenille yarn and yarn over your hook. And you're gonna hold all of this together, and when you put your yarn on your hook, you're going to grab the whole group of the string. So just hold everything in your non-dominant hand. And you're going to yarn over and chain 1 through the acrylic yarn. And now we're actually going to chain 1 because that was technically just joining on. Now we chain 1 and now we have our magic ring. A lot of people like the chain 2 method, but this is so much easier than trying to close your yarn. I recommend at least trying this a few times. It probably took me a good 8 to 10 tries before I had it down and I could just do it whenever. My sister, she's been crocheting for a few weeks. She uses this method too. It's actually, in my opinion, easier than a regular magic ring too. Keep that in mind, give it a try and see how it works for you. For my dragon pattern, it starts with a single crochet of 6. So I'll be putting 6 single crochets into the acrylic loop we made. Now here's a couple of tips before you go closing it up. One, you don't want to pull your end of the chenille yarn too hard, because if you pull it too hard, it'll be hard to work into the first single crochet. So what I like to do is take both ends of the acrylic and shrink them down a little bit, and then pull the chenille yarn through. You can see there's still a bit of a loose little hole through it. I don't know if you can see it, but it is there. And what I'll do now is do my second round and then finish closing it up afterwards. So let me show you what that looks like. For the second round of Dahlia, it is an increase in each stitch, so that's what I'll be doing. And that's the end of round 2. So now what you can do is turn it over and finish closing up the hole. I like to pull the chenille yarn first as tight as I can, and then the acrylic yarn on both sides. And now I don't see a lot of people talk about this, but you want to be securing your magic ring or your chain 2 method on the inside. So even if you don't use this method, you'll want to secure your center tail by just creating a couple knots on the outside. What I'm going to do is take my 2 acrylic ends and I'm going to tie them together to create 2 knots. So just some basic knots. And then I will tie the chenille yarn to the 2 acrylic tails. And this just makes it ultra secure, and if somebody gets their finger in there and tries to open it up, it'll be a lot harder to get it in there and open it up. Next tip we are going to talk about is how to crochet the bobble stitch. Now this doesn't just apply to the chenille yarn, but I think it's important for people to learn this stitch and how to do it properly. This is how I would color change for the bobble. I actually just yarn over with the orange yarn, or whatever secondary color you're using, as if I were yarning over with my primary color. So I just yarn over, insert in the next stitch, and then create the incomplete double crochet. And I'm going to do that for however many times the pattern calls for. So I will be creating 5 incomplete double crochets into the same stitch. And then this is what it'll look like when you're done. You'll have the bobble, and then your primary color will be the first color, the first loop on your hook. To finish the bobble, we're going to take our primary color again, and we're going to finish the bobble. Normally you just yarn over, pull through. What I want you to do as you pull through is push with your middle finger, push the bobble out. And this will help you get a really clean bobble if you push it out. And then same if when you single crochet in the next stitch, keep pushing the bobble out so that it looks nice and clean, just like that. And then pull your tails as necessary if anything came loose while you were working with the primary yarn. But that's how you get a really clean bobble, and you can apply that bobble stitch to just about any project you're working on, and it can be in different yarn types too. The other just little tip that I have to contain the mess of plush yarn is to pull the fluff right off the tips of your yarn and set those aside in a pile, and this will just keep things from like flying around while you're trying to work with it. Now I'm going to do the second bobble. The coolest part about this, the way this color changes, is that you can tie the tails immediately after crocheting the bobble. because tying them together won't affect the stitch on the top. Now we're going to make the ears on Dahlia. So here's where I'm at, where I would want to put the ear. And we're just going to make the ear as the pattern calls for. So for my ear, it's a chain of 5, and then there's a bunch of special stitches in it. Now instead of just single crocheting in the next stitch like the pattern calls for, what you're going to do is actually take your hook and insert it into the front loop of that single crochet stitch we made previously, and then insert directly into the next stitch. You'll yarn over and pull through those loops and then finish the single crochet as normal. And this will close up any gap you have between the ear and the 2 single crochets. If you didn't do this, there would be a little gap, and it's much more noticeable when you stuff it. So this is a great trick if you want to just close up that hole. So before I continue on to the pattern any further, I want to talk about how I know I'm at the end of my round without a stitch marker. If you are comfortable using a stitch marker, continue using it. But this is for that moment where, let's say you lost your stitch marker and you can't find your spot. Maybe while you were crocheting it fell off and you don't know where the beginning of the round is anymore. With this pattern, you know the beginning of the round is on the bottom of the head. So that gives you a starting point. What I like to do is look at the head wherever I believe the beginning of the round is. I look at it straight on, and you'll see your magic ring in the center, and then you will see your increases around it. What you're looking for is where your increase and your first single crochet of the single crochet round meet. It is an increase here, and then there's a single crochet. So this tells me that the beginning of the round is right here on the last stitch of the increase, and I can just trace that up to here and know that I'm in the right spot. Now if you're working and you have an increase single crochet 1, you would look for your increase and then your single crochet 1. I've gotten to a point where I can just see where the spiral ends and trace it up. Just practice that, and eventually you get to the point where you can just look at it and know. So I'm going to move on to my decrease round, and I know because of this pattern my decreases will be next to the ear. But I want the decreases to be on top of the ear. So what I'm going to do is just single crochet 1 and then decrease around. And I'll just be resetting the stitch marker at the last decrease, and it will overlap just slightly, but this will prevent the gap from forming behind the ear. If you have a gap, you can just sew it up later. It's a little tedious, but it's better than having that big gap. And this can be a little hard to do. Usually I'll just do a decrease by picking the front loop of the first single crochet and then going through both loops on the second single crochet on the other side of the ear. And the reason I do this is because it can be really hard to get that front loop. And now there is no gap behind the ear, no gap in front of the ear, and you're good to go. Now I'm going to insert safety eyes real quick, and I will meet you back when I have another trick or tip to share with you. The next tip I have for you is how to stuff properly. I actually get this question a lot more than I originally thought I would. I use polyester fiber fill. I get it by the 10-pound because I'm trying to make this my business. With the stuffing, you'll want to make sure that it is loose. You don't want it to be hard packed at all. You just want it to be kind of squishy. You can get your fingers and squish it. There's not any resistance to the squishing. What you want to do is you want to take a small amount and you want to stuff the nose. And while you're stuffing, use the palm of your hand or your fingers to round out whatever it is you're stuffing. That will help you keep it circular and round. And then as you stuff some more, remember to break up your stuffing and then stuff it in. I like to stuff one end and then build up from there. So I'll stuff the forehead first, behind the eyes. Make sure that when you stuff, you're getting the safety eyes and making sure the back is in the center. So if you stuff it, sometimes your eyes can do this. So just make sure you wiggle the stuffing around so that it is around the safety eye. And you're gonna stuff a little bit more than you think, but you don't want it to be rock hard. You want it to be hard enough that when you press on it, it keeps its shape. when you're stuffing a head or a body or whatever, you want to make sure you're getting under where your decreases are. Once you're finished stuffing, what I like to do is take my extra long metal needle, and you want to make sure this is something that doesn't bend. I recommend metal because it won't stick. So what you can probably do is find like a small knitting needle or find a really heavy duty needle like this one. I honestly have no idea where I got this from. I think the one I got from Hobby Lobby is really bendable. Just keep an eye out and see if you can find one that isn't bendable. And what I like to do is take this needle and just basically felt the stuffing out, and you just kind of rounding things off. If there's any spot that kind of sticks out weird, use this needle to smooth it out. And that's how I stuff my pieces, to keep them nice and round, keep them really pretty. You can really get away with a lot of stuffing issues if you have something to smooth it out afterward. For the bigger pieces especially, you'll want this because it can be really hard to get the stuffing to be round. That's how I stuff. Don't be afraid to pull it out and start again as well. The body is finished, and I have another tip for you. We are going to sew up the bottom of our tail closed, and I'm sure a lot of you out there already know how to do this, but just in case you don't, I'm gonna go through it. So I'm using the plastic needle, not this one because that one sucks. This one because it's nice and smooth. And what I'm gonna do is thread the needle, and I'm just gonna leave a little tail. What we're gonna do is we're going to collect all the front loops of the hole we're trying to close, whether it's tail or anything else. And when you yarn through, you want to try and keep your tension pretty loose. So you don't want to pull the yarn like this away from a stitch. You want to make sure you're pulling it through the stitch. And this will help you with the yarn breaking up. And for something this small, you know, you wouldn't want to use the trick I'll be showing you later in this video. Just be kind of a waste of time. So just be gentle and make sure you pull all the way through. If your yarn starts to break up like this, where around the needle it's starting to fall apart, pull your yarn a little bit further onto the hook so you're working on fluff again, or not hook. So I created my knot, and now I'm just going to tuck this tail in like I normally would. So what I'll do is I'll weave this in through my work just 3 or 4 times just to make sure that tail's secure. And instead of cutting this tail and having this scrap yarn, what I like to do instead is actually tuck the tail in. And I'll do this with the point of a scissor, and I've seen some people use needles to do this, but I'll use the point of my scissors and just stab it into the doll. I like to do this because I have a lot of scrap yarn. I don't love stuffing my dolls with scrap yarn because it changes the way it feels when I'm sewing with it. But when I do this, you're having way less scrap yarn ends to worry about, and you can just shove them right in there. And now we're going to actually sink the eyes in. I recommend doing this for a bunch of your patterns, not just my own. If you have a pattern that kind of turned out a little wonky, maybe the eyes are sticking out on the side of the head, sinking them in just makes them look a lot nicer in my opinion. So I'll be doing this with acrylic yarn. You could do it with the Chenille yarn if you'd like. Personally, this yellow yarn is falling apart, so I'm going to be using the acrylic yarn and a long metal needle because I'm using the acrylic yarn. Otherwise, you'd want to use a plastic needle. You insert your needle through the bottom of the head, or just like an inconspicuous space on your doll. And you're going to pull out a length of yarn right in the corner of one of the eyes. And what you're going to do is go into the other corner. So this is going to be where you would sink it in, so I'm sinking mine in vertically rather than horizontally. You can do it horizontally if you'd like. It changes the look a little bit. And what I'll do is I'll come immediately over to the next eye, so you can see my needle here, to the other corner of the eye on the same side. Pull this tail, and this tail will be controlling this one when we're done, because you can't pull that one very tight since it's not tied to anything. And then what you'll do is do the same thing on the other eye and go to the other side of the other eye. And then again into the corner of the eye, back to the other side. And then for our last loop, we're gonna go meet back with the original tail. So what I like to do is actually sink the eyes in with my fingers first, and then pull the acrylic yarn to match that. And then adjust as needed. The acrylic yarn is more slippery than the Chenille yarn, so keep that in mind. You'll have to make a tighter knot when you're done. And when I finish, I just tie the 2 tails together, and a little bit tighter than I think I would need it because it is going to loosen up a little bit. And then tuck these tails in And same with what I did earlier, I'll just tuck these directly in and save me having to worry about the yarn scraps later. But now we're going to move on to the sewing part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make all the pieces for this dragon, and then we are going to sew them together. And I'll show you a couple tricks for sewing with the Chenille yarn, because I know that is one of the main issues with this yarn. I have returned. I finished all the body parts, and you might notice that I have short tails on all of my pieces, and that is because I know for a fact this yellow yarn falls apart. If you look at it, it'll fall apart, and that tells me that I won't be able to sew with it easily at all. Sometimes I can get away with sewing with the Chenille yarn. Usually it has to feel a little stiffer. Usually the softer it is, the harder it will be to sew. I know that's kind of weird, but that's the way that I've found it works. So this orange yarn here, it feels a little stiffer and more full, so I would be able to get away with sewing with this yarn. If I try and sew something on and it doesn't sew on easily and it's just a big old hassle, what I'll do is I'll take the thing that I want to sew on, so we're going to take a leg, and what I would do is attach some acrylic yarn. What I'll do is I'll thread my needle with the acrylic yarn, whatever needle you're going to end up using. Make sure your foot or whatever you're working with is stuffed, and you want to leave a tiny bit of head space because we will be tucking the tail into this piece. So what I like to do is take my needle and insert it from the inside to the outside on one of the stitches. Usually the slip stitch is where I would do this. And I pull up a tail, and you want a tail long enough to sew the piece on. These aren't very big, so I'm not going to leave too long of a tail. And then you're going to cut your working yarn. You just need a short little tail, and what you're going to do is tie the Chenille yarn and the acrylic yarn together just with a couple of knots, and then you're going to tuck these two tails into whatever it is you are sewing on. There you have a new end joined, and you can sew with the acrylic yarn instead. So I'll show you how I sew it on and what it looks like as I go. So the leg goes slightly under the eye. I sew it on like an oval, and then I always go over twice. Limbs that little children would hold on to, especially if you're selling your dolls, you would want to reinforce twice. And I'm going to actually put my slip knot on the top of the arm so that the arm kind of faces the head. So I'll make a slip knot by just inserting my needle under a loop, and then I'll weave this tail in. As you can see, that was so much easier than actually trying to work with the Chenille yarn. And then when I'm done, I'll just tuck this in with my scissors like I did earlier. And you can see the yellow yarn is barely noticeable, and it's only when you like pull the leg all the way back that you can see it. And this just is more secure, it's much easier, there's no trying to finagle it to get it to work. The other tip I actually have is how to sew your limbs on so that they line up well. And what I like to do is flip the doll over, and I take my second leg, and what you're going to do is you're going to trace the center, or about the center, to where you're going to put the next leg. So I know that this is the center round right here, and I'm going to insert my needle and pull it through. And then I know that this round is the next round. You see how it lines up? So I'm going to put my next stitch there, and I know to turn here. When you're working with the acrylic, you want to make sure that you're pulling pretty tight as well. Just keep that in mind. And I know that the round is 3 stitches across, so I can line up this with this round here. I don't know if you can see that very well, but if I trace this leg over to here, then that's where it lines up. And here is the finished dragon. Now there's a couple of things you have to do first. And the first one is to take your needle that we used earlier and adjust stuffing anymore. Use your hands and your fingers to move it around as well. Just smooth things out, especially after sewing everything together. You could have some lumps that you need to press out. And then the second thing you need to do is violently shake it. And what this will do is it'll reveal any issues that you might have. So say you accidentally looped something the wrong way, shaking it out will reveal that. And shaking it out also helps get rid of some of the loose fluff from sewing and everything. Make sure to shake it, check to make sure there's no issues with the doll, you know, do any trimming that you need to do. And then when you're done with the final check to make sure everything is nice, then your plushie's finished. If you like this video, please leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment. If you have any advice that you would like to give, maybe there's a technique you use for Chenille yarn, let us know in the comments. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you in my next video. Bye everyone.